Imagine that you are living in Russia, and let's be clear, you're one of those 75% of Russians who live in big cities. And you don't have a huge house within the city borders, you are an ordinary Russian with an ordinary apartment. If you are not very rich, then usually your apartment building is either a big Soviet commie block, a huge modern Russian commie block, or a small commie block which is called Hrushchevka. Today we will talk specifically about this type of buildings. Why are these 5-story boxes not as bad as they seem to be, and why is it absolutely impossible to live inside them in 2020? Let's start with the definition. What is a Hrushchevka? It is a kind of prefabricated low-rise flat block that was erected in the tens of thousands across the USSR in early 1960s. As you might have guessed, they owe the name to Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, a man who became a leader of the Soviet Union right after Stalin. And it was he who decided to solve the Soviet urban housing problem with such buildings. Hence the name, Khrushchev plus K. Wikipedia will tell you that such houses are often called Khrushchevы, from the words Khrushchev plus Trushoby, slums in Russian. But to be honest, I have lived in a city filled with Hrushchevkas for more than 20 years, and I have never heard this version of the word. So Hrushchevkas were the solution to the housing problem of the USSR. But where did that problem even come from? You can blame the great and terrible industrialization and the development of the communism. From the very first years of its existence, the USSR set a course towards industrialization and urbanization. Millions of villagers flooded the cities of the USSR, so the housing problem became acute even back in the 1920s. Comrade Stalin solved the problem radically. He was against single-family housing. There were barracks and dormitories for factory workers, as well as communal apartments for everyone else. All apartments in which noblemen and rich citizens lived before the revolution became communal. Between 3 and 7 families typically shared a communal apartment. Each family had its own room, which served as a living room, dining room and bedroom for the entire family. All the residents of the entire apartment shared the use of the hallways, kitchen and bathroom. The toilet was outside, in a courtyard. Residents were asked to be patient for the sake of building communism and a new collective bright future. It is possible that they would have had to endure for a very long time, but then the Second World War happened. The cities of the European part of the USSR were practically destroyed, 90% of the housing stock was demolished, and the USSR had to be rebuilt from scratch. Comrade Stalin once again did not really want to do this. Barracks and temporary brick houses without any communal amenities were once again rebuilt for the common people. But this time new grand buildings for the Soviet elite were built. Monumental structures, which are now called Stalinkas. And by the way, these were really great apartment buildings. Even in modern Russia, a flattened Stalinka is very valuable. But they did not solve the housing problem, since 80% of the urban population still lived in temporary wooden barracks and communal apartments. Therefore, Khrushchev faced the task of solving this problem as quickly and as cheaply as possible. And I must admit that Khrushchev actually succeeded. Nikita Sergeyevich had two options. He could continue Stalin's work and build monumental strong houses, which were actually quite expensive. Or he could come up with something new. Of course, Khrushchev chose the second option. In his 1954 speech, he criticized Stalin for squandering. The quote was, "They spend people's money on beauty that no one needs, instead of building simpler but more." Sometimes I look at Stalinkas in my city and think to myself, did he actually call these excessive beauties? But then I look at the Hrushchevkas and I understand that yes. In 1955 the construction of all Stalinkas was stopped, and new architectural rules were adopted for the entire Soviet Union. A complete abandonment of any excesses such as garlands under windows, balconies or fretwork, standard design for every house, full focus on the quick and cheap construction. However, the very idea of Hrushchevka was not invented by Khrushchev. Its author was the famous French architect Le Corbusier. He formed the basic principles of functionalism even before the World War II. The use of straight geometric lines, mostly rectangular, the absence of excessive architectural details on the facades, the use of ready-made glass and reinforced concrete panels in construction, a simple color scheme. The shape of the house was supposed to correspond to its purpose. And the purpose of these houses in the USSR was simple. People needed a place to sleep and eat, so they could rise up early in the morning, go to work and build a communist society. Basically, people just needed a small box with a bed. The smaller, the better. First Hrushchevkas appeared in Moscow in 1958. What were they like? First of all standards for the dimensions and areas of premises were greatly reduced. The area of the kitchen was set to 5-6 square meters, the area of the storeroom to 2 square meters. Bathrooms and toilets were combined. The minimum ceiling height was 2.5 meters, the minimum room width was 2.2 meters. Garbage chutes were abandoned to reduce the cost of the construction. There were no elevators, that's why all Hrushchevkas were built 5-story. Soviet doctors conducted special researches that showed that a person can live in a house without an elevator on the 5th floor without any harm to his health. Therefore, an elevator had to be built only if the building had 6 floors or more. Fun fact, the diminutiveness of the Hrushchevkas was actually presented as their advantage in the Soviet advertisement. Yeah, another fun fact is that there actually were advertisements for Hrushchevkas in the USSR. There were lines that sounded like this: "Before now you had to take 500 steps to prepare a borscht for your husband, but in the new small kitchen you will have everything at hand." Anyway, a Soviet person should eat in the canteen at work. Why would he need a big kitchen? Even the staircases of these houses were ingeniously thought out. They were exactly such a width that 2 people could carry the coffin with a deceased person in their arms down horizontally, and not an inch wider. From the outside, these houses looked as utilitarian as possible. They were just boxes. Rows of endless boxes that stretched to the horizon. The most typical Hrushchevkas are from K7 series of houses, which can be found in any part of Russia. It was created by Vitaly Logutenko. The houses were assembled from large frame panels. An unprecedented speed of construction was achieved. One house was built on average in 12 days. I have listed a bunch of disadvantages of such houses, but of course they also had their advantages. Finally, after 50 years of pain, Soviet people were able to live in a single-family apartment. That is, a young family could request a whole new apartment from the state, and not a small room in a communal apartment. Imagine the joy of people who move out of the communal barracks where they lived with 4 other families. And they moved to a small house, true, but it was their own. The courtyards of the Hrushchevkas also turns out to be green and comfortable. The houses in Hrushchevkas blocks are typically located pretty far away from each other. Many say that they were built this way for the greater stability in the event of a sudden nuclear strike. It really helped. The courtyards of the Hrushchevkas are still the most comfortable courtyards in Russian cities, which sadly cannot be said about the apartments themselves. As a result, until the very fall of the USSR, a clear division arose. Richly decorated Stalinkas with spacious rooms were intended for the elite of the society, and compact Hrushchevkas for ordinary workers. It should be noted that Hrushchevkas could be different, built from panels, bricks and even large blocks. In rural areas, 2- and 3-story Hrushchevka buildings were built, but most of the time they still had 5 floors. There are also several typical features common for all Hrushchevkas: small areas and low ceiling, poor noise and thermal insulation. And then there are some very strange architectural solutions. For example, what can you say about such a window inside some apartments? A window between a toilet and a kitchen. The most likely purpose of the window is due to the fact that power outages were not uncommon during the years of the construction of Hrushchevkas. In this case, a small amount of light entered the bathroom through the window, which made it possible to use the toilet and wash basin. I actually had such a window in the apartment where I grew up. And if you consider that this apartment was communal, yeah, great bonding opportunity for the neighbors. In conclusion, I can only say that Hrushchevkas are a very controversial thing. On the one hand, they made it possible to finalize the urbanization of the Soviet Union. Many Soviet cities, such as Amursk, were built literally from scratch in a couple of years in the middle of an endless taiga, precisely thanks to the Hrushchevkas, the speed and cheapness of their construction. Due to the availability of housing in the USSR after Khrushchev, a population explosion began, which helped to restore the country's population after the devastating war. On the other hand, the Hrushchevkas were heavily criticized throughout their history, even in the 60s. They were criticized for small kitchens, walk-through bedrooms, bizarre proportions of some rooms, combined bathrooms, lack of loggias, combined roof without an attic in most houses, poor sound insulation, low energy efficiency, inexpressive and dull appearance. I can go on and on. Since 1969, Hrushchevkas have gradually ceased to be built. They were replaced with multi-story houses that you call komi blocks now. Guess how they are called now? Of course, Brezhnevkas. Some problems were solved. Kitchen became bigger and there were loggias now, but they are hardly a major improvement in terms of inexpressive and dull appearance. Do not forget that the Hrushchevkas were supposed to be a temporary solution to the housing problem. They were supposed to be a home for Soviet people for 25 to 30 years. And let's be honest, now it's time to let them go. This is what the authorities of Moscow and St. Petersburg are doing right now. Renovation programs are underway there, and soon there will be no famous Hrushchevkas in these cities. But don't worry, go to any smaller Russian city and you will definitely find dozens of them everywhere. And not only in Russia, you can find them in Estonia and Latvia, in the Czech Republic and Serbia. Even in Cuba you can rent an apartment in an authentic Soviet house and pretend to be a simple Soviet man who returned to his little Hrushchevka flat after a whole day of heavy labor with the dream of building a bright communist future.